say one of the advantages traveling, if you really have to travel during the Corona crisis. Even almost empty train, and so I can record a little bit more on the go while I'm traveling, what I always wanted to do, but now I'm not annoying my co-travelers. What's up everybody, Rackwitz here. So, what is the advantage of some crisis? That some industries, I think, or some topics now are more obvious, more positive to think about it than the other way around, or during other times. And so I think one of the industries, one of the topics that really hasn't benefited during this kind of crisis is behavior psychology. And with that, of course, also game thinking, gamification. So I have to admit, of course, we don't have to talk about the health issues during the crisis, but from my point of view, from my business point of view, I like this opportunity, as it seems to be a proof again that humans change if they have to. And then suddenly they can do things that they never thought before would be possible. One example is the education industry. I think Corona is probably the best motivator for education to change and now to think about digital tools and how we can integrate them. But anyway, when it comes to gamification, most questions we get is from, okay, how can we use game thinking? How can we use behavior psychology to change behavior concerning the actual context that's changing? How can we make remote work more applicable? How can we perhaps get people to behave in a more secure, more healthy way, whatever. It's not just about health now in the Corona crisis. It's so complicated, so complex. And so there's a lot of different behavior that people, companies are really looking for to change. And then I think what's important to think about that, or here in this case, if you're, for example, think about how can we use gamification, or should we use it at all, or behavior psychology is, do you want to trigger a behavior that becomes an actual behavior? Do you want someone to change, to do something in the short term? Or does it has to become a behavior in the long term? Do you want to trigger a behavior and then you hope that in the future people will keep doing that kind of behavior? And that's an interesting question, because if we think about it, if we want to gamify something, we want the activity itself much more engaging. So we want the people to recognize the activity, to get the satisfaction out of the activity, the autonomy, the progress, whatever, the competence, everything that we achieve when we are involved in an intrinsic motivated activity like game, sports, and hobbies. But I think what's not possible then is to make it an actual behavior, because a behavior is something that you can do on the go. You don't have to think about it. It's easy for you to do. So you don't need a lot of brain capacity to do those. But especially the intrinsic motivated activities like games, sports, and hobbies are the ones who are so are designed around excitement, and you have to focus on that. And on the contrary, the flow that we all want to achieve is defined by how many brain capacity can I get from you, how can I make it immersive as possible. And a behavior is most often the contrary. So the question is, if you want to make a behavior to become an actual behavior, so that you're doing it, executing it without thinking about it, we have to find a way in the beginning to trigger it, and then to make the activity in the beginning as exciting as possible, so that you are, because it's not a behavior yet, are always motivated to come back, to keep going, to stay motivated. In the best case, of course, to change the extrinsic trigger that we had at the beginning to get you started doing something, to change it an intrinsic trigger so that you're coming back by yourself and we don't have to trigger you again. And then the point is that as soon as we realize, okay, now you're doing that, for example, every day for 6 weeks in a row, that's a theory that if you do something for 6 weeks in a row, every day, probably it's going to become a behavior. And if that's the case, if we can see that that's happening, then probably we have to design gamification out of the system. because we don't want to stay in the way. We want to make it as easy as possible for you to I have to show my train ticket. You have to make it as easy as possible for the people to behave something. And when you make it exciting, challenging, whatever, it's not easy. It's not something that you can do on the fly. And so that's the difference. If you want to make something a real behavior, you can use gamification to come to the particular point until something becomes a behavior, and then you have to get out of the way. I think this is really important.
Und bitte die Maske aufsetzen.